I want to thank, although he's not here, Rabbi Doron Perez for his leadership of World Mizrachi and for his partnership, and in person to thank Rabbi Rakoff. Our discussions of our celebration began many months ago, and we're already beginning our conversations of how not just our shul and not just in Nassau County, but how the metropolitan area Jewish community will, Miz Hashem, celebrate next year's 75th if we're not all there together yet. I want to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, who really needs no introduction, Rabbi Haskel Lookstein. Rabbi Lookstein has been the rabbi of Congregation Kilat Yeshurim since 1958 and principal of the RZA School since 1966. He is the Joseph H. Lookstein Professor of Homiletics at Yeshiva University, Vice President of the Bethlehem of America, and a member of the Board of Directors of the UJA Federation of New York. Rabbi Lookstein is also a commissioner of the New York City Human Rights Commission. He received his BA from Columbia College and earned his ordination, master's degree, and PhD from Yeshiva University. Although it was very recent, they may add on to this bio that he is a potential pitcher for the New York Mets. He did that in honor of his recent birthday. The Mishnah states, Bentishim L'Shua. However, many Mefarshim comment that this word is not to be read in that fashion, but rather from the idea of Lasua, to speak, to converse. Shein kocho ela b'sicha b'torah u'v'tfilah. Rabbi Lookstein's voice has been a voice for decades in tefillah, in prayer, with his sermons, and the sermons that he has worked on to develop many, many rabbis in that class of homiletics. I myself did not take that class, but I considered myself to be a Talmud of a Talmud because I was an assistant rabbi to his assistant rabbi, and much that he gave over to Rabbi Dale Polikoff, Rabbi Polikoff gave over to myself, and I'm indebted to that. Rabbi Lookstein got the call yesterday to be here with us, to speak about From Darkness to Light, personal memories of a lover of Zion. Our speaker, Mrs. Mazi Melissa Pilip, could not be here tonight, and she looks forward to joining our community and introducing herself in the future. And for Rabbi Lookstein to come out, he said the following: I owe this to the community to share my memories and reflections of the founding of the State of Israel. I am a soldier of the community. Rabbi Lookstein, indeed you are a soldier of the community. You're not a soldier, you're a general, a rabbi's rabbi. Our communities look to yours for guidance on different issues, and it's a kavod gadol for us to have you with you many years of shanim aruchim involved in the community. Please rise in honor of Rabbi Lookstein.
Thank you, Rabbi Axelrod. I want you to know that one of the reasons that I'm here is because I have a new grandson who's here, Yoni Brick, married to my granddaughter, Tammy, and it's a special privilege to come to his shul, where he grew up and became an absolute lover of Zion and made aliyah and served in the paratroopers. And Baruch Hashem came back in order to meet Tammy, and with God's help, the two of them, Yirtzeh Hashem, will go back to Israel. Him going back and she going up after Tisha B'Av of this year. So this is my chance to be in the Young Israel of Woodmere and to salute the two of you. Zeh hayom asah Hashem, nagila v'nismach bo. That's what we're going to say tomorrow morning in Hallel, celebrating Yom Haatzmaut. And we will celebrate it. And we will be ecstatic. And our children in yeshivot will sing and dance. And in Israel, they'll have barbecues. That's what they do on Yom Haatzmaut. Did it ever occur to us to ask the question, why our generation deserved such nachas? Of all the generations in the last 2,000 years, why did our generation merit such a celebration, such a geulah, such a deliverance? Why? Why after 2,000 years was it we who deserved this? Surely other generations had more merit than ours. The generation of Rabbi Akiva, right after the destruction, who gave his life for Torah. The generation of the Rambam, the generation of Rabbeinu Tam, the Vilna Gaon, the Besht, the Baal HaTanya. Why we? What did we do to earn this? I actually heard this question for the first time from Rav Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, when I was in his shiur. And he asked the question. And his answer was framed by a parallel to Geulat Mitzrayim. The first, Me'afela La'or Gadol. And he quoted the Chazal, asking, why did Bnei Yisrael in Mitzrayim merit leaving Mitzrayim 190 years early? They were supposed to be there 400 years, according to the promise to Abraham Avinu. And they left after 210. Why the early Geulah? And their answer was that Bnei Yisrael were not liberated from Mitzrayim because they merited the Geulah. Yetziat Mitzrayim happened precisely because Bnei Yisrael were mired in the Mentes Sharei Tumah. They were steeped in Egyptian idolatry. And had they remained in Egypt for a little while longer, they would have disappeared because there are only 50 levels, and they were on the 49th level. God took the Jews out of Egypt not because they merited it, but because they had to be redeemed then. Because had they not been redeemed then, all of God's vision of history would have been obliterated. And the promise to Abraham Avinu would never have been fulfilled. Said the Rav, our generation experienced Hakamat Medinat Yisrael not because we deserved it, nor merited it, but because Judaism and the Jewish people, after the Holocaust, might not have survived. We were in the depths of Afela in 1945. I'm not interpreting how history worked. I'm not giving a psak that we got Eretz Yisrael from the world as a kind of give back for what we suffered. I'm just repeating what the Rav said about the Ribbono Shel Olam's vision of history. He had to take us out from Afelah to Orah because he was so down that we simply might have disappeared, and the whole course of divine history might not have been able to proceed. We were at our lowest point, with 6 million murdered, with more than 250,000 displaced persons, with 3 million Soviet Jews trapped in that land, unable to continue being Jewish, with an American Jewry that was dreadfully disorganized, powerless, facing anti-Semitism, even in the face of the Holocaust, because the world hadn't come to terms yet with the Holocaust. We were at the height of anti-Semitism in the 1930s and 1940s here in America. If you think things are getting a little bit bad now, I can tell you, having studied this for my doctorate, they were much, much worse there. I grew up in a community where there were German Americans who were vicious anti-Semites. And a Jew who would pass by one of their rallies on 86th Street, looking particularly Jewish, was taking his life in his hands. And out of this state of depression and demoralization came a series of hidden miracles that led to Hakamat Medinat Yisrael. It almost didn't happen. Some of you are old enough to remember that. Most of you maybe read it in books. On November 29, 1947, I remember being glued to the radio, listening to the vote in the United Nations on partition, which would lead to a Jewish state. That vote had to vote for partition by a 2/3 majority. For perhaps the only time, or certainly one of the only times, in the history of the United Nations, the Soviet bloc and the American bloc voted together. Talk about Nisim Nistarim. Russia and the United States and their blocs voting together. And the vote was 33-13 in favor. A change of 3 votes from pro to con would have been 30-16. No partition, no Jewish state. It almost didn't happen. That's why we're going to say tomorrow, Zeh hayom asah Hashem nagila v'nismach bo. On May 12th, 1948, not more than 2.5 years later, the day, 2 days before the English mandate was ended, and all the English soldiers left on May 14th. On May 12, 1948, the Va'ad Le'umi met in Tel Aviv to vote on whether a state should be declared. The Jews of Palestine were surrounded by heavily armored Arab armies. The United States State Department had urged Ben-Gurion not to declare a Jewish state. Postpone it. You're not ready for it. And Ben-Gurion was determined to move ahead. But the Vad Le'umi had to decide. My father described how Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon was flown from Jerusalem, which was encircled and unreachable, flown by a Piper Cub with his legs hanging out of the plane in order to be able to get to Tel Aviv and vote in the Vad HaLe'umi. And you know what the vote was? 6-4. There were 10 people voting. Let me read to you the description of Mordechai Ben Tov, who saw the event. In the room sat 10 Jews who had to make what was perhaps the most important decision in the history of the people of Israel for 2,000 years by a slim margin of 6-4. The People's Administration, the Vad Le'umi, voted in Tel Aviv to declare the first sovereign Jewish state since Judea had fallen 2 millennia earlier. It almost didn't happen. But it did. And because it did, we will celebrate tomorrow and sing Zeh Hayom Aso Hashem Nagila V'Nismach Haba. But 19 years later, in May and June of 1967, we came this close to losing the whole thing. Again, you have to be old enough to have experienced May and June of 1967 to realize how close we were to another Holocaust. I was old enough, and I remember the fright that we had when Nasser sent his Egyptian troops into the Sinai, and the UN force that was there to keep the peace and prevent them from going into the Sinai disappeared. According to Abba Eban at that time, in his famous words, like the fire brigade that ran at the first smell of smoke. And they closed off the Straits of Tiran. And the Arab armies surrounded the infant state of Israel with its Auschwitz borders. Syria to the north, Egypt to the south, Jordan to the east. President Lyndon Johnson spoke stern words, but took no action to eliminate the blockade of the Gulf of Eilat, which was an act of war. The United Nations met, but was useless. American Jews saw from the distance a noose that was tightening around the neck of the Jewish state, then only 19 years old. I remember those days vividly. I remember Shabbat, June 3rd, 2 days before the war started. In our congregation, my father held a joint appeal, the only one in our history, for UJA and Israel bonds, and raised that morning more than $3 million. Because, after all, what good was our money if there would be no state of Israel? And what was going on in Israel? We spoke to our friends. For 2 weeks before the war, our women friends didn't send their children to school because they were afraid that during the day the war might break out, and it was just 10 miles across the narrow waste of Israel, and the Jordanian legion might have cut off the north from the south, and their kids might have been on the other side of the line, and they would have no access to them, so they didn't send their kids to school. And then came the morning of June 5th. And those of you who are old enough to remember the morning of June 5th, over the radio, starting at 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. Radio reports about how the Arab countries were the forces were pouring into Israel. The Haifa refineries had been bombed by Syria and were aflame. Egypt was coming into the Negev from the south, Jordan from the east. And I was taking my kids to school. And I was driving on Madison Avenue. And I couldn't see the road ahead of me because I was crying. And the tears were coming down. And I thought I was experiencing another Holocaust. It was so real. And then shortly after 12 noon, Israel Radio, which had been silent, opened up, and we discovered what actually had happened. In the early hours of that Monday, June 5th, when the Israel Air Force took off on a preventive mission and destroyed all the Arab air forces on the ground in their airfields or on their airfields. 2 weeks later, when Israelis davened at the Kotel on Shavuos, I almost said the first day of Shavuos, on Shavuos, and they said, Zeh hayom asah Hashem nagila v'nisnachavo. They said it in a way different from any other time they had said it. Israel had been lifted me'afela la'or gadol, misakana l'shalom, min hametzar karasi ka, from out of the straits I called to God. We called to God from the straits of Tiran. But when God answered us, Anani b'merchav ka, He answered us with breath, as Pinchas Peli, alav Shalom, put it in a speech in our shul the following September. He answered us b'merchav, with the whole West Bank, with the entire Sinai, with the Golan Heights from which terror had reigned for years, and above all, with the liberation of Yerushalayim, with access to the Kotel and the Temple Mount, from which we were barred for 19 years, from 1948 to 1967. That miraculous victory was not hidden. Israelis saw it. You all know the famous, iconic picture of the Israeli paratroopers at the wall. They weren't from Hasidim. They were probably secular young men, but they were dominating that wall because it was a resurgence of religion in Israel right after this tremendous victory, this tremendous miracle. This was a nes galui for those of us who believe in nisim, and even for those who normally don't believe in nisim. It was clearly Even ma'asu habonim hayasol rosh pinah, the stone that the builders scorned. Israel became the foundation in the Middle East. Me'et Hashem haytazot. It was clearly the work of God. It was miraculous in our eyes. Never before had those words been spoken by us in such glorious happiness. And something happened to the Jews in the Galut as a result of 1948 and especially 1967. Galut Jews had always been somehow cowed by anti-Semitism, by anti-alienism, and by all kinds of prejudice. We went through 2,000 years of exile, and even in our best times, we were essentially bowed like question marks. That was our posture. We were proud. Now, we were proud of the state of Israel. No more question marks. We stood up like exclamation points. We stood up proud of our people, proud of our Judaism, proud of Israelis who saved our world, even as they saved their world. And it wasn't just us. Soviet Jews, ask Natan Sharansky. Beginning in 1967, after the Six-Day War, they began to find out, what is this? What is this country? What is this people to which we belong? But the word Jew on our identity card was only a disadvantage. Maybe it's an advantage. And they began to rise, and a renaissance came about, which Israel led with the help of many, many American Jews. And more than 2 million of them eventually left the Soviet Union, more than half of them coming to Israel. And something else happened. Young boys who, like me in my youth, would never dream of wearing a kippah outside. I went to Columbia College from 1949 to 1953. I never saw a Jew with a kippah outside. There was one guy by the name of Don Newman who wore a hat. And in a class, he had a black kippah. One in all of my freshman class. Nobody wore a kippah outside because it just wasn't done. We were question marks. Besides, sometimes it could have been dangerous. But suddenly, after the Six-Day War, we began to wear kippot srugot. And Ephraim Kishon, the noted humorist, wrote a serious article about the Hesder Yeshiva boys in their kippot srugot who had a siddur in one hand and a rifle in the other hand. The kippah sruga became a symbol of our pride. You think I ever would have worn a kippah like this? My father would have had my head if I did it. I had to wear a shmata, that nylon thing that we gave out to everybody who came in if he didn't have a kippah. And if he had a kippah sruga, one of our ushers would walk over to him and say, we don't wear those things here, and gave him a shmata instead to wear. No more. Not after the Six-Day War. I remember having fights over it in shul until it became accepted to wear the kippah sruga. Zeh hayom asah Hashem, nagila v'nismachavo. That war was a watershed of celebration and confidence for Israel and for world Jewry. However, and with this I will end, but it may take me a few minutes to get to the actual end. Pinchas Kelly pointed out something else that I will never forget. Think of the crescendo in Hallel. Odecha ki ani soni vatehi li bishur. God, you answered me, and you were my salvation. Even ma'asu habonim, the stone that the builders rejected, Haisel Rosh Pinor became the foundation. Think of Israel and the Abraham Accords, the foundation that Israel is in the Middle East today. Me'et Hashem ha'itazotin in flood ve'einu. This is certainly from God. No question about it. And therefore, Zahayom Asah Hashem Ragilu V'Nismachavo. What's the next verse? What's the next verse? Ana Hashem Hoshiana. We're on top. We're ecstatic. But we have to worry. Because the next calamity is just around the corner. How prescient was the psalmist. How precisely and perfectly he saw the twists and turns of Jewish history. What happened after the Six-Day War? Well, if you remember, or if you've read the history books, the first thing that happened weeks after the Six-Day War ended, the Arab nations gathered in Khartoum in July and proclaimed the famous 3 no's. No peace, no negotiations, no recognition of Israel. In utter calamitous defeat, our neighbors, our enemies, declared war all over again. Ze hayom aso Hashem v'gilo nizmacharo Ana Hashem Hoshiana. God, please save us from such enemies. But that's not the only thing that happened. Another very important thing happened. Israel took on another appearance in the world. No more were we the weak, downtrodden, beaten people. Suddenly, we were the victors. France didn't like us anymore. They liked us when we were victims. But now that we were victors, France disconnected from us. I beg your pardon? Okay. We would not be led like sheep to the slaughter. We were the strong power. We had stood up against overwhelming odds, and with our technologically modern air force and armor and heroic pilots and soldiers and God's blessings, we fired our slingshot and slayed the giant. But in the process, in our dramatic victory, we began slowly but surely to be viewed by the world as the giant and not the plucky warrior, as Goliath and not as David. Some of it turned out to be actually good. The Catholics sought some kind of rapprochement with us, dialogue. They wanted to know how this despised people, destined to wander the world, came to its land and became so strong. Maybe there is something theologically to be found out about it. Pope John the 23rd tried very hard to do it. The evangelists saw the blessings of Abraham Avinu and began to love us. Not because it's the forerunner of the Messiah. It's because they read the Bible seriously. And they believe that the people who bless Abraham will be blessed by God. That all changed after the Six-Day War. But for much of the world, including Western Europe, and today, unfortunately, many Americans, including many American Jews, the appearance of Israel as the powerful victors, rather than the oppressed victims, led to the politics that we see burgeoning before us as we are now called the oppressors. In today's world, for many people, the victim's cause is their cause, and we're not victims anymore. And power, strength, achievement, technological genius are things to be envied, but not praised. And so, dear friends, tomorrow, on Yom Haatzmaut, when we sing Hallel, let us sing Ze Hayom Aso Hashem Nagilo V'Nismachavo with all our hearts, and be grateful to God for how Medinat Yisrael has changed our lives and the fortunes of the Jewish people in the most blessed of ways. But let us remember to say with full kavanah, Ono Hashem Hoshiano, and beseech him to stand by Medinat Yisrael and Am Yisrael and help us to enjoy God's blessings of Hashem Oz Li'amo Yitain, Hashem Yevarech Es Amo, Shalom.
Please remain standing for our tikva by Cousin Joel Kaplan. Kol ode balevav elima nefesh Yehudi homiya ulefadei Mizrachi-Long ayin l'tzion Sophia. Od lo avedot tikvateinu, hatikva bat shenat alepayim, liot amechoshi ve'aretzeinu, Eretz Zion Yerushalayim, liot amechoshi ve'aretzeinu, Eretz Zion Yerushalayim. This closes the program for this evening. Thank you, everybody, for being here and coming together as a community. As soon as everybody has returned, we are going to have Ma'ariv right here.